Hey guys, welcome back to the last part of the Realistic Railroad Guide. Sorry for taking a bit longer to make this one. I was more focusing on the Aurelia series and haven't had time for this, but here we are. And today I will show you, as promised, a precision method of designing and building a railroad in this game. Please go check out the previous parts of this guide where I explain some things that I'll talk about in this video. I put them all into one playlist. Link should be in the upper right corner now. So this method actually resembles how a real-life design process goes. We will be using some spreadsheet software like the Microsoft Excel or the LibreOffice or OpenOffice Calc to create what's usually called a written height profile. It will be a bit more complicated. You should probably know some spreadsheet software basics, but in the end, we will have a really nice built railroad. So let's get into it. We are back on the same map, looking at the first variant of the railroad that I've built. Let's just imagine that I'm starting from scratch here and I didn't build the railroad yet. I have 2 points that I want to connect, the 2 train stations, and now I need to decide where is the railroad going to go. For this method, you need to take some vanilla pedestrian path because the surface variant does not alter the terrain underneath it, and that is important. And then you use this path to mark the way for the railroad, just like I did right here. Also notice that I marked the position of the curve starts and the ends. You should do that too. Of course, I just copied the location of the railroad that I built previously, so I know that the pavement path is in a position that is going to yield a good railroad grade on the entire track. Not very deep cuts or high embankments as well. For a fresh build, you obviously don't know that, but you can still do some rough checks for the terrain height differences as you go forward with the path, or you can just build it blindly, go through the process I will show you here, and then do some changes. Just like in real life, where designing a railroad is usually some iterative process. So let's move on. Now we picked the path for the railroad and marked it using the pavement path here. Now I want to open some spreadsheet software and start designing. I will walk you through the entire thing. Alright, so I will start, for example, at this third row, and I'm going to mark the columns by doing the headlines first. So this column is going to be for points, basically like the start of the curve, noting if it's a start of the curve or end of the curve. Then if it's a curve, then I need its angle, and a few more things. For example, the tangent line length. Then we will definitely need its radius, that's kind of important, and also the segment length here, and that is also for the straight segments as well. Then we will need the distance from the start, very important. Also, terrain height, we will have to measure that. Now, the railroad height is going to be the last one, and the railroad height column is going to be the most important one. For the last column, that's why we are doing this. In here, we are going to have the heights of the calculated railroad, so we can then build it, all right? And also the first row in here is going to be the starting point, so I'm just going to type in start, all right? So now, let's go. Now, the first point in here is going to be the point right at the train station, so that's going to be the curve start for the first curve. So I'm just going to type in CS1. And the second point that I'm going to measure, that I'm going to calculate, is going to be the end of it. That's going to be curve end 1, okay? And usually, if it's a curve, I would like to write down like the angles and all the other columns for that end point, okay? So now I'm going to go in the game, and I'm going to take, for example, the pavement path again, and I'm just going to measure all those things. So for example, I'll do this, and I'm just going to measure. So I have 157.4 degrees for the angle and 407 meters for the tangent length. Okay, so I just need to type it in here. Hopefully I'm not going to forget it. So 157.4 and 407 meters for a tangent length. Okay, so these 2 columns are the ones that I need to measure in the game. The rest I'm kind of going to somewhat measure, especially the segment lengths. I'm going to measure for the straight segments. I can actually do that for the second one, right? So I'm going to go, for example, to this one, and I'm going to measure the segment length. I can do it with any kind of network, obviously. It's 461, okay? So that is the segment length that I need to type in for this third row, okay? I actually forgot what was the number here. What was it? It was 461, okay? 461. There we go. So I'm going to do these, the next ones a bit faster, okay? So now that we have this, we need to go into the game again and measure the terrain heights. So I'm going to use the extra landscaping tools for this, again, just like in the previous videos I did. And I'm going to measure for each of these points in here the terrain height so I can fill it in the table. So I'm going to start, for example, with the station down here. As you can see, the station is at 200.4. So I'm just going to go and type it over here. And with the next point, this is, by the way, why it was important to use the vanilla pedestrian path, so that it doesn't alter the terrain and we can measure the terrain height. Just like before, I'm just going to speed this up while I'm measuring this. Alright, so now we measured the terrain heights, which we will later use to kind of get some idea of how deep cuts we are doing or high embankments. Now for the railroad height, we actually need to type in this first number from the terrain height, because this terrain height is the height of the station where we need to start from. Also, this terrain height in here is the terrain of the station, so we need to end for this terrain height as well, but we won't type it in because we kind of need to calculate it. And then after correct calculations, these two numbers in these two cells need to be exactly the same. So now we need to fill in the rest of these cells. So for the radius, I need to fill only the cells where we have written the angle and tangent lengths, okay? So let's start over here. And I'm just going to basically write down the formula that we have already seen, I think, in the first video, okay? So I'm going to have the tangent length multiplied by the tangents of that angle, so tan, and in brackets I'm going to write. And now this angle is in degrees, okay? So I need to, for this function in the spreadsheet editor, I need to convert it to radians. So radians, brackets, angle, bracket ends, and the angle needs to be divided by 2. There we go. And that's it. Now I can just copy this into all these windows here, all these cells, like I said before, where I have the angles and the tangent lengths, okay? Simple. Alright, so now I'm going to do the segment lengths, and I'm obviously going to calculate them again for the curves, because for the straight segments, I already have them written down in here from what I measured in the game. So, again, from the first video, we have the formula for the segment length, or for the length of the curve. And it goes like this. So it's 2 times pi. Then it's multiplied by, I do believe, the radius. Yes, the radius times, now double bracket, 180 minus the angle. And that's divided by 360. Okay? Yes, that is correct. I have already calculated it before, just so that I know that I'm right. And again, I can just copy, paste it into all these windows where I have the radius, obviously. Okay, so now I have all the segment lengths. Easy. So now we can do the distances from the start. Now it's kind of clear that for the first point, for the starting point, the distance from the start is 0. Now for the second one, it's going to be equal to the segment length, the first one, and then we are just going to add up more of these segment lengths. So the next cell is just going to be the previous one plus the next segment length, okay? And we can just copy it all the way up here. And we can see that we are arriving at some 5,700 meters, which is the overall length of the entire railroad. Okay, so now we can finally calculate the railroad height. So first we need to get the grade. And the grade for the entire railroad, unless we are having some special situation, should be constant. So I'm just going to type it, for example, up here. I'm just going to type in the max grade and type it right here next to it. So for example, I'm going to pick 1%. Okay, so 1. I'm going to type in 1 in that window. Now I'm going to go to the second row for the railroad height. Obviously, the first one is the height of the station, which I measured. So the second one needs to be calculated. And that should be, I should get the segment length. And now I need to multiply it by the grade, but obviously the grade is in percent, so I need to divide it by 100. Also, this all needs to be put in brackets, just like this, because I need to add the previous height to it. So this one, okay? And this is the height after going to the second point, okay? And before we are going to copy this, we also need to put the dollar sign for this formula for the G1 in here, which is obviously the not changing cell for that grade. Okay, so I'm just going to put little dollar signs right there, and now we can stretch this down. And as you can see, we are arriving. Let me just put only one decimal point over here, or maybe 2. 1 doesn't really matter. Well, actually 2, because we see 2 in the game, okay? And we are coming some 3 or like 2.3 meters short for that height we need. So now, like I said before, these two numbers need to be exactly the same, okay? So what I need to do is kind of iteratively change the maximum grade. So I can see that 1 is not enough. So let's just add maybe 1.05, okay? And as you can see, that's already kind of close. I'm almost at the correct height. So let's just put 104, and this is almost it. This is almost it. So maybe just 35 or 38. Let me just do it. There we go. And these numbers are almost the same. Just one, what is that? 1 centimeter difference. That's not really that big of a deal. Okay, so our railroad, we have calculated that we are going to use the 1.039%, and we are going to arrive exactly, almost exactly 1 centimeter difference to the height that we picked for the upper station. Okay, so now we have calculated the very important railroad heights, and now we can actually go and build. But before we do that, I'm going to just do some kind of a check of how the railroad is going to look like based on the terrain height, okay? What I did here is some kind of a rough check of how the railroad is going to look like in your terrain, and it's actually quite straightforward. All I did was to plot a graph, and on the horizontal axis, I have that distance from the target that we actually didn't use for the calculations, but we are using it in this chart. And on the vertical axis, I have the terrain height, or just the height in general, okay? And now the blue line represents the terrain, and the red one represents the railroad. It's obviously completely straight because we are using just one grade. And as we can see, we are kind of very nicely actually going over the terrain. In real life, you definitely want to, it's not like a 100% rule that you must do it, but you should try to have the same amount of earth excavated and used in the embankments. And in here we kind of see that we are favoring the embankments a bit because we are going with the railroad a bit over the terrain. Now obviously we only measured the terrain height at the points, at the nodes where the curve starts or curved end. So it's kind of a rough mapping of the terrain. Obviously, some hills are over here, for example, I know that, and maybe even over here there's some kind of a curve in here, if I remember correctly, and it is cutting into the terrain. But it's more important, this view is more important to see if maybe you are having some crazy high embankments or maybe crazy deep cuts or something like that. The highest embankment that we are going to create here is probably over here at this location, and it's maybe like 6 meters tall, which is kind of a bit on the higher side, but it's not, definitely it's nothing bad. We did create a tunnel towards the end of the railroad, and again, we are not really having like a correct or precise mapping for the terrain. If you really wanted to precisely map the terrain, then you can definitely do it and basically create a nice chart displaying the height of your railroad. So yeah, I think this is looking nice. Now let's go and build it. Okay, so now on the screen I only have the railroad height in this column. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to use the extra landscaping tools, the level terrain, and this little box to type in the terrain height from the table. Okay, so the first one, the 280.4, I don't need to do because that's obviously the height of the station. So let's just move on to the next node, which is right here. And in here we need to do 288.75. Okay, and I can just take some reasonably bigger brush and just put that height all around that node. Okay, I don't need to be that precise over here because then later I'm going to put the heights back nicely. Okay, I'm going to show you. Anyway, I'm just going to speed it up here and do it for all the rest of the nodes. Okay. Right, so now we have it. Now we have it almost prepared to build the final railroad. So what I need to be doing now is to delete the segments before, well, actually the entire marking pavement that is marking the position. I need to make sure at this point, I need to make sure that all of these are built, all of these markers where the curve ends or start, they are built 90 degrees to the path. Now I already did that, but you probably need to, at this point, need to double check that, because what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be deleting this path. I'm actually going to quick save it in here just in case I do any mistakes and I don't have those markers at 90 degrees. Okay, so I'm just going to be destroying these. You know what? I'm actually going to move it to do this a bit faster. I'm going to select only the nodes, and I'm just going to be selecting the segments in between the markers, like I said. Now the markers are very important, and because they need to be those 90 degrees towards the path, because we can then use that, so we can always do the railroad 90 degrees to them as well, right? If they were not 90 degrees, then I obviously would not know how to do the railroad. I wouldn't do the connections right, and I would just be unable to build it. Simple as that. Okay, so let me just destroy this last segment, and let's go. So now we can just quickly build the train tracks. I'm going to take the curved road, the freeform. I'm going to need the road guidelines because tracks otherwise won't snap to pedestrian paths. I will have to have the straight slope activated, and that's probably all. So let's go. Now, like I said before, we are going to connect it just like this, all the way to that road guideline point on that pedestrian path. For the straight segments, you really need to use the straight track feature, and sometimes you can see that it's not exactly going to give you the right angle. So that's why you need to unsnap to angle and place it like that, and then snap it back. Okay. Now we are going to do curves. So again, the freeform, and just continue all the way like this. It's going to give me, for example, tunnels over here. You can keep that, I suppose, because I have the mode, the normal mode, so that the game is going to pick the type of the railroad, right? But we are obviously going to switch that back later, okay? So it's kind of possible that the game is actually going to give us elevated railroad over here. No, it won't. Okay. So that's kind of telling me that, oh wait, never mind, it did. So the game thinks that this embankment was a bit too tall, but I don't think it is. I honestly don't think it was. Okay, maybe it might be a good idea to actually disable road length as well. We don't really need it over here. Okay, and it's obviously important to also always do the 180 from the starting point. Okay. And as we can see here, we again need to uncheck the snapping angles. And again, it created some elevated segments on its own. In here, it's probably going to create the tunnel like we had here before. Yeah, and it almost created it exactly where we had it. And now we can just put the final segment right here. And there we go. So that is it, guys. That is it. So like I said, some of the segments that the game created, the elevated ones, we might switch to embankments, but otherwise, this is it. This is a very precisely built railroad, and here we can see a train with the realistic speeds nicely going into it. All right, so that was it. And just a quick thing, now that we are finished, we can just take the extra landscaping tools again, and we can just go to these places where we have put those, like patches of heights, and we can just hit the Control Z, and there we go. It's going to put the terrain nicely back to what we have had there before. Just like that, simply all the way around the track, okay? So you can do this after you are finished. It's going to make the terrain look like you have not done any terrain modifications on it completely, and you will have a very nice railroad, realistic railroad, all right? Okay, so that is it. This is where the realistic railroad ends. Like I said in the beginning, go check out the other parts if you haven't already. This is definitely a bit advanced method, but I really like it. It was actually the first method I used for building a realistic railroad. Some of you probably saw it on the live stream some time ago. Anyway, I hope it was useful to you. If you have any questions, post a comment, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you some other time. Take care and bye.